the moon. I've always been intrigued and fascinated by the moon. Why? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's because of how it lights up the night, especially if there aren't that many stars in the sky, or even when the stars are also in the sky, where it just makes the darkness look more fascinating and maybe less scary. Though there are times where the moon can sometimes make the atmosphere look more creepy or feel more creepy at times. But nonetheless, the moon usually has benevolent purposes, as despite being seen as a colder counterpart to the sun, thanks to it only appearing at night where things are likely to get cold or dark, at the same time, the moon provides a sense of comfort through the light that it depicts, though technically the sun's light actually provides the moonlight, but nonetheless, it does give off a very tranquil yet serene atmosphere, like if you know what I mean. And it helps that the moon is very prominent in various cultures and stories, especially folk tales, like for example, like the tale of the bamboo cutter, or better known as the tale of Princess Kaguya, the Moon Princess, right? Along with other cultures or stories, like the story of the Moon Rabbit and how it sacrificed itself to prove that it could be hospitable and generous like the other animals, right? Though, interestingly enough, both stories are actually tragic cases of the moon and stuff, though, nonetheless, they are very impactful and actually serve a kind of special lesson. Though, what the lesson was in Princess Kaguya, I'm not entirely sure. Though, it is interesting how the moon's phases also change shape and how it sometimes coincides with various time periods or even certain days or months of the week or even the seasonal changes. And fun fact, in ancient cultures, the moon's phases, like depending on where or how it changed, it apparently was theorized to have been connected to a woman's menstrual cycle of all things, which I was surprised to find out, given I am a woman, like physically speaking. And interestingly enough, the moon was also seen as a source of insanity or like lunacy, hence the term lunatic to describe someone who's crazy, as Luna is associated with the word like moon in Latin. Though funny thing is that Luna is also the name of some moon goddesses, at least in Roman culture. Though the proper moon goddess is Selena, who is the Greek goddess of the moon, and while Artemis, she or Diana in some cases, they do share the title the moon goddess, though that's only partial, as Diana is mostly associated with like hunting or even like the wildlife of the natural world. Though speaking of Diana along with Selena, like funny thing is they actually get referenced in Sailor Moon of all things. And same thing with Artemis, as the three cats that or well initially there are two, but there end up being three cats where they're basically you could say the fairy companions of like magical girls. Though in this case they serve as allies to Sailor Moon and Sailor Venus specifically. Though chronologically speaking, Artemis he appeared first at least years before Luna did, as he was supposed to help Sailor Venus or Minako, she calls or that's what she's called in her civilian identity, like find out her destiny. Though it is interesting how she was associated with the moon despite not being Sailor Moon, or at least not or at least she hasn't met Sailor Moon yet. Though given how it's shown that like at least in the manga version of Sailor Moon, where Sailor Venus was actually one of Sailor Moon's bodyguards, so or at least Princess Serenity's bodyguards. It's back before Princess Serenity became Usagi, who in turn would become Sailor Moon. And speaking of Luna, she also shares like the name with the Roman goddess of the moon of the same name. Though interestingly enough, they're the third cat that appears, Diana, who's well, she I guess she's mostly like Chibiusa's sort of companion, at least for the future. As I was saying before I kind of got interrupted, which I apologize about, I was talking about Diana and how she herself is actually from the future, similar to Chibiusa, where she ends up being, I guess, Chibiusa's main animal companion, similar to Luna and Artemis, who are her parents, at least in the future. And Diana, she shares the name with the Roman goddess, or the Roman version of Artemis, which is ironically used as a boy's name in the case of Minako's Artemis, where Diana is named after the Roman version of Artemis, who is the goddess of the moon, given that there's a lot of mythological, or at least Greek and Roman mythological elements in Sailor Moon, which I thought was a pretty neat cultural tidbit. But overall, it is interesting how even like a magical girl like series like Sailor Moon would also be influenced by Greek or Roman or classical culture, especially since I myself actually majored in, or at least I'm trying to major in classical studies as well as English. So I thought it was interesting to point that out. Well, when it comes to fashion, like personally, I'm not really a fashionista or a very like I guess clothing based person. As I like to wear clothes because obviously I don't want to go nude or become an exhibitionist or anything. But personally, I've never really been that interested in fashion, or at least not the latest kind of fashion designs. As I prefer to just simply wear clothes and that's it. Though there are two kinds of fashion that I want to try out, like namely like the Lolita fashion. No, not the creepy novel that talks about like uh basically like a pedophile, but the Japan where the Japanese like Lolita or goth Lolita as most people refer to call it, where it's basically a Victorian or European style kind of outfit or fashion style that's very popular for teenagers and even adult women, as it sort of displays like a sense of femininity that can be described as cute, though while it can come off as rather uncomfortable, especially with like Japan's somewhat questionable laws regarding like the age of consent. But nonetheless, like it is very interesting one. I've always though I'm not sure if I could pull it off myself, but I've always wanted to try something similar. Yeah, another thing I want to try is cosplay. And while I've worn costumes, especially for Halloween, though that was only when I was in elementary up to middle school, where I wanted to try like cosplay, given I like to watch different shows or movies, or especially if they're animated, as I have a soft spot for 2D anime or traditional animation, like the kind of like the kind you see in Disney movies or even like animes, which I was very intrigued by. And fun fact, Sailor Moon was actually the very first anime I ever watched, or rather, the Sailor Moon S movie Hearts and Ice that made me intrigued when it came to anime, or at least the anime art style, which I plan to implement in some of my stories. Though I'm not entirely sure what character I could cosplay as, given how I don't really have any clothing, or at least proper clothing for something like cosplay, especially since, like, if I want to hear cosplaying is very expensive at times, and I'm not sure if I have, like, the proper body shape for it either, so what can you do? But overall, it's very interesting to see how people wear cosplay as a way to express like how they feel or at least show their love for certain like I guess shows or forms of media and entertainment, which I think is pretty like neat or at least very interesting hobby. Though I think I could only do cosplay at least once in a lifetime. I don't want to make it like I don't want to make it a recurring hobby because I feel like it's too expensive and I probably wouldn't have that much interest in the long run. Though going back to Lolita fashion, I think if I were to try the Lolita fashion, maybe I could try goth Lolita, but I think I want to try like classic Lolita or even the black and white Lolita or even the sailor Lolita or wait, is it called? Yeah, I think it's called the sailor style Lolita where it looks very refined and something. And I want to try the Wa Lolita, which is the traditional Japanese style, which is funny considering that Lolita fashion already came from Japan, though it just took on a more Western style, or more specifically Western European, or even the English kind of Victorian style, or in some cases Edwardian, which is interesting as to how cultures tend to change over time. And another reason why I want to try the sailor Lolita is because I was actually a sailor, at least back when I was, well, when I was in the Navy specifically, as I worked, well, I mean, not worked, but I got my experience in that when I was in, I got my first experience when it came to the Navy as a sea cadet, but eventually I grew interested in the Navy, and so did my father, and as a result, he and I, like, well, he helped me get enrolled in, or at least apply to the actual Navy, and once I passed the first test there, I was able to like join as, well, back then it was called an ordinary seaman, or that was the lowest rank, or a beginner rank, but until it got changed to sailor like third class. Though over time, like at first it was good to be in the Navy as I felt like I was working for some kind of purpose, but over time it proved to be too stressful and exhausting for me. Then because it also kind of got in the way of my studies as well due to me being there on certain days or time periods. So I ended up quitting and I couldn't even get past, well, I couldn't get past for basic training, so what could I do? Though I at least enjoyed like doing the chores such as cleaning up and even like checking the inventory to make sure everything was in stock, along with like doing the boating exercises. Those were my few favorite or good memories that I had. And it helped that I actually made a friend there, though I won't be saying his name for privacy reasons, but we still talk with each other this very day, even after I moved, so that was good. I mentioned Sailor Moon as being one of the early animes that I watched, or I think the very first anime I ever watched and became interested in, which caused me to, like I mentioned before, extend my interest to other anime as or even manga. And because of that, I know a bit of Japanese. But another thing I liked about Sailor Moon was how she and the other Sailor Senshi, or Sailor Scouts as they were called in the English version, where they are basically like superheroines in their own right, and it sort of gets alluded to as they have their own fans in universe as a result, and they all have different powers that make them unique from each other. And personally, I kind of like the idea of superpowers, though I don't have it in real life. Though if I were to have superpowers, which is highly unlikely at this point, is I think I'd like to have elemental based powers such as like you could say water manipulation, or as it's called in its proper term, like hydrokinesis, which is on the superpowers wiki if you want to look up. And another power that I would like to have is something plant related, or you could say earth related, not earth as in the ground, but rather something related to the trees, the flowers, and other kinds of flora, as they are essential to life along with water. Yeah, which is probably why, if you looked on my video regarding my favorite Pokemon starters, you'll notice that a lot of my favorite Pokemon are either grass type or water type, and I'd like to have powers similar to those. And another power I'd like to have is probably like something psychic, like telekinesis or psychokinesis, because I think it'd be easier to grab stuff without having to use my arms a lot. Or, but then again, that would probably make me lazy. And plus, given how the majority of psychic characters tend to go insane or even die because of those kinds of powers, it'd probably be maybe as like a last resort I would use it, or I could use it some for minor things that wouldn't be too stressful on my mind. Yeah, and probably the same thing for water or grass-based powers, as I feel like it would probably be dangerous if I were to, or if someone forced me to use them against my will. So I would definitely have to conserve as much as I could so I wouldn't overexert myself or accidentally injure someone, especially given the whole like power kind of incontinence as TV tropes would call. So thanks, TV tropes. Another thing I've always wanted to try, other than simply like cosplaying or wearing Lolita fashion as cosplay, as they basically intertwine at this point, was voice acting, as I've always liked the idea of acting as certain characters, though personally I prefer to do it kind of behind the scenes, especially for animation, as voice acting basically gives characters life in their own way while telling a story. Though in some cases they can do impressions of other characters, but nonetheless, it is very interesting how certain actors or people can actually like visualize or convey a character's personality through simply audio or just by moving their mouths in different ways. And I've always wanted to try something like that, given how I can do certain impressions, though I'm a bit rusty nowadays, though I like to do it sometimes, especially since I like to monologue or because I talk to myself, or at least when I think I'm alone, right? Even my dad actually suggested I could try voice acting, though where I can do it is anyone's guess. Though I hope to do it someday, like even if it's for like a small side gig or anything. As like I mentioned before, my goal is to become an author or at least a professional story writer, so I can tell or create stories rather than simply voice act it. Though I could voice act if I wanted to for some of my characters as a sort of inside joke or as a sort of author avatar, as many creators do the same thing when it comes to their shows, especially if they're animated. Though I think the first and only time I was ever in an acting experience was when I was in elementary school, where it was this sort of indigenous inspired play that we had to do where me and this other girl we had to play the role of the season of winter, as like there was a lot of shamanistic elements in it, though like ironically our role was supposed to be villainous, as the season of winter in that story was supposed to try and take over the other seasons and thus trap the entire world in an eternal winter. And I forgot how the play ended, but I know that we were supposed to be defeated by the other seasons through a song of some kind, and that was about it. And finally, I'd like to talk about my favorite ice cream flavors. Where, while I do like ice cream, but there are specific flavors that I prefer to eat, or at least most of the time. Where my number one favorite is obviously, well, may not obviously, but it's vanilla. Even though it may sound plain or simple, I like the flavor because of how sweet it is and how it rolls off the tongue easier for me. And my second favorite would probably be mint, or more specifically chocolate, or mint chocolate, as I like how it has a sort of zing to it, and the chocolate makes it sweeter, at least depending on what kind of chocolate you put in. And my third favorite would probably be cotton candy, given how it has a sweetness that can be rivaled with vanilla's, but it's no, I know it's more sugary, but at the same time, it actually tastes really good to me, especially compared to bubble gum, which I personally don't like. It tastes weird to me, and overall, I think those are my main favorite ice cream flavors. Though I keep thinking about that episode from Codename Kid Next Door, or Kids Next Door, where the episode involving number five trying to find out the fourth flavor, but we never really find out what it is, given how they keep interrupting it, or at least only alluding to it. Though, given it has a yellowish or goldish color scheme, my personal theory is that it's something maybe caramel based or even butterscotch, but who knows? It could just be literally any other flavor as far as we know.